Hello and welcome to Renee Reports. Tonight we're going to have a special panel of guests to talk about the upcoming election, everything that you need to know to fill out your ballot. I'll be introducing them in just a minute, but I did want to remind folks that ballots were sent out to registered voters October 13th. So if you didn't get a ballot by now, you might want to check with King County Elections. Clearly, the races for Seattle Mayor and City Attorney, as well as King County Executive, will determine the direction of our region on a variety of issues, including the pandemic recovery, homelessness, and public safety, to name only a few. But like I mentioned, tonight we have a panel of experts. First, I want to introduce Devin Glazer. Oh, we lost Devin. Okay, we'll come back to Devin. Oh, no, there's Devin. First, I want to introduce Devin Glazer, the co-founder and executive director of Upgrade Seattle, a grassroots advocacy organization dedicated towards the creation of a public internet utility here in Seattle. He is a lawyer, writer, and activist whose work has appeared in Crosscut, The Stranger, and soon, the Georgetown Law Technology Review. Devin is motivated by a strong belief that we're all better off when we pool our resources for public good and has never met a monopoly he hasn't attempted to take down. Thank you very much, Devin, for joining us. And now I'm going to bring in Debbie Carlson. Hello, Debbie. Oh. Let's see. Hold on one second. Doesn't look Devin can hear or can speak. Can you try and talk, Debbie?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Cool.
How about now?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there's an Bluetooth device that was stealing my audio. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Let me introduce Debbie. Debbie Carlson is an LGBTQ plus advocate, co-founder, and former executive director of LGBTQ Allyship. She has been working in the labor and LGBTQ plus movement for 17 years and has been leading workshops on LGBTQ plus workers' rights for the last 6 years. In the early 2000s, she helped start the Seattle Queerly Classed discussion series that lasted for 5 years and highlighted topics such as LGBTQ plus housing justice, the impacts of debt for LGBTQ marginalized individuals, LGBTQ plus gentrification from Capitol Hill, and much more. Carlson was part of a broad coalition of leaders supporting and visioning the Seattle Department of Labor Standards, created in 2015 to include the experiences of LGBTQ plus employees. She was a committee member of the Child and Youth Advocacy Board, also known as Best Start for Kids, excuse me, the Seattle Ethics and Elections Committee, and the Seattle Housing Levy Oversight Committee. As part of her tenure at LGBTQ Allyship, she co-founded the LGBTQ plus South King County Task Force and the 2020 Queer the Census Washington Coalition. And our final panelist tonight will be Fernando Medina Corey. Let me bring him in. Welcome.
Hi.
Fernando is a philosophy and politics graduate from Whitman College who inexplicably became a software engineer. Why? We have plenty of those. He currently lives in the greater Seattle area and spends some free time digging into public donor data and researching candidates for local office. First, I want to thank each of you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
me.
Now let's start by asking, what are the issues that you're closely monitoring during this election cycle?
Do you want to
call us? Or, yeah, how should we?
Yeah, I'm just throwing it out there. One by one, take turns.
I mean, there's always 1,000 issues that a mayor in a city has to deal with, but I think particularly as it's another rainy night and it's very cold, it's hard not to think that there's 4,000 people sleeping outside right now. It's kind of come to dominate most of the election coverage, but also I think it's been a big moral failure of the city that we let this many people go without. So I think that's probably the number one. And then because I care about actually solving that, then how candidates pledge to pay for the housing we need is always the number two, connecting issue that really motivates at least who I vote for.
Yeah, I would second that. Definitely homelessness and housing have been on my radar, and who has been doing the work and who has been alongside communities that have been grounded in the work for years and who has the mechanisms to fund it, because that's really the key issue that has been lacking for a while, is a real clear, decisive leader to really identify ways to fund what we know will work, what we know that advocates have been telling us for years. This is what's needed. So, and I'm also looking particularly for and city council, but even in King County Council, who are really willing to and interested in really moving the bar around police accountability, around safety, around COVID relief, and just really like dealing with the issues that our communities are facing right now while we're still in the middle of a pandemic. And it feels like it's been forever, but we're still in the middle of it. And we need people that will be really leaning on experts and communities that know their communities and know the solutions that need to move forward.
Excellent. And Fernando?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are both excellent points, things that would have been on my list. I have the enviable position of going last after you've already articulated things that are probably at the top of the list for me. I think the only thing I'd add on top of those would be thinking about which of the potential leaders going forward are going to tackle things that we need to tackle around climate change. So if that's figuring out how to make the city more resilient to climate catastrophe situations, weather that we've already seen being exacerbated by climate change involving the heat domes, or the, now more storms in the winter season, and those kind of reinforcing the issues that we have around trying to make sure that everybody has a safe place to live in a shelter that's going to keep them alive at this point. So I think those are things that I think about when I think about who to vote for.
Nice. Debbie, I wanted to ask you in particular, this is a very liberal, progressive area. So why does it really matter, what candidate an LGBTQ person should vote for? I mean, aren't they all progressive and liberal?
Is this Debbie or Devin? We sound a lot. Sorry.
Debbie.
Well, a couple things that are really apparent, whether or not you're an ally or part of the LGBTQ community, is how accessible you are to leaders, to different organizational leaders, but also different community leaders. There are different candidates that are more well known for being more accessible to the LGBTQ community, and really dedicating a sense of partnership and trusting communities that are impacted, trusting LGBTQ community members and leaders about what are issues that are really impacting them, and then what are solutions. And so that's one of my that's what I'm looking for in a candidate, is who has a proven track record for that openness and having that track record of working with LGBTQ communities. But then also a step further, when we think about progressive politics within the LGBT, or just for LGBTQ rights, often a lot of people think about marriage equality, or maybe even gender neutral bathrooms within like the city hall, or kind of more although maybe gender neutral bathrooms aren't as traditional as marriage equality, but people tend to look at those tend to be the LGBTQ issues that is kind of the litmus test for progressivism. And it's not. We LGBTQ folks, we need to be at all of the tables making decisions that impact our lives. And we need to be included in budgetary decisions. We need to be able to feel that we know any department heads, anyone that, like, for example, a mayor would appoint, has a track record. It can be an ally, but has a track record around LGBTQ competency and knowledge and rights. We need kind of the whole spectrum of government and officials and administrators that are really being held accountable to enact an LGBTQ equity lens. That's what progressiveness looks like for LGBTQ folks. It's not just an issue. It's a comprehensive approach to including an LGBTQ equity lens at every level of government.
Absolutely. Let's see, I want to ask a question of Fernando. Let me bring him in here. Hello, welcome back. Fernando, I wanted to ask you, because you do look into the publicly available, donor data. And so I wanted to ask you, like, why should people pay attention to who's funding what campaign, what political action committees, and donors are funding what?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. The biggest thing, I'll kind of piggyback off your earlier statement about, we're all progressives in Seattle, right? Or that's kind of the assumption when you think of Seattle races. I think that's not actually the case this year. Even we have a city attorney race that there's a Republican running in, someone who became a Republican during the Trump administration, which maybe not as many people are aware of. But beyond that, even if you just look at kind of the typical Democrat versus Democrat races, even though they're nonpartisan, when you look closer at who's funding those races, it becomes clear there's a pretty big gap in terms of the interests between very large groups of people. So, you have working class renters and people who are going to be very interested in things like renter protections, increased protection from eviction, especially given the problems that came up during the pandemic. And then you look at some of the races and who's donating to them. There's tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of donors or dollars going from massive real estate interests to some of these candidates. And those are the things that I think about when I'm in those looking at the data in those races, is who is actually going to represent the interests, I think, of more of the working people in Seattle who have those kind of baseline needs just for things like shelter, making sure that their worker rights are protected. So I tend to pay attention a lot to those things too, because I think that they're often what differentiates these races more clearly for me, because sometimes you will have plenty of candidates who are on social issues. Maybe they are both somewhat progressive, but when you look at some of the more sorts of material issues around housing and job security and just employment protections, those sorts of things, I think really start to change the picture.
Now, Devin, I wanted to bring you back in just for a minute. Now, we know each other for a long time. You obviously have a lot of interest in the LGBTQ plus community. So why should LGBTQ plus voters, care who represents them?
Yeah, so I think, as you said, like, we live in a blue city and it feels like it's a relatively gay-friendly city. But what matters is what people do with that support. And so, as an example, like in the mayor's race, one of the candidates has actually led and passed a ban on conversion therapy. And had you asked a random politician 10 years ago, what does the gay community need? Maybe they wouldn't have gone there. But seeing gay marriage not as like the end goal, but as one of many steps that kind of make life easier for, the gay and queer community is really important. And then also, kind of to chime in with what Fernando was saying and having an actual Republican in the race, they've run a lot of really, homophobic type pushes in what's otherwise being described as being anti-sex education for elementary school. But we're not teaching elementary school kids like things about sex. We're teaching them about orientation, gender identity, things that really help kids, one, feel comfortable in their own skin, and two, stop bullying. And so to have a candidate who feels like they would want to politicize, sex ed in school, it's just an old school dog whistle about people who are not comfortable around gay people. And so to see that again in Seattle in like a serious race is scary, because I think we're not out of the woods. There are still threats to the gay community.
I want to bring you all back in, actually. Welcome back. So basically, I would like to talk a little bit about the mayor's race. Obviously, Bruce Harrell and Lorena Gonzalez, council president, are going head-to-head in that race. It is the most expensive mayor's race, according to the last 19 years of, donor election data. And so, potentially the most expensive ever. We don't know because we've only had 19 years of records going back to 2015, I think, right?
It'll be more expensive in 4 years. They just only ratchet it up. It's pretty sad.
That is true. Very much. Very good point, Devin. So basically, we're both lawyers, which, is what it is, right? But basically, I wanted to turn to you all and ask you a question. And that is, clearly, this has been sort of defined as a race between the activist political at left and the more moderate progressive folks. Is that how you see this race?
I mean, I feel like the word moderate and progressive almost mean different things there, right? So Seattle tends to have two lanes in politics, particularly after a primary. There's the candidate that gets hundreds of thousands of dollars from big tech corporations and from Comcast, CenturyLink developers, and the candidate who doesn't. And they kind of all jockey to see who that left-right lane is going to be, but it pretty reliably happens each cycle. So what we're seeing right now is Bruce Harrell is telling all of his donors that he will not tax them. He'll ask for voluntary donations. Is telling the Police Officer Guild he will not crack down on them. He will say they should look at a video and sign a pledge. And he's kind of benefiting from this, like, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. And so I don't think it's comfortable to call that moderate just because we happen to use the Democratic Party label as our identifier. While Councilmember Gonzalez really is pushing for new taxes, higher taxes on those who are actually really benefiting from our current success in order to pay for the things that those companies are causing. And that's the left-right divide that we'll see in basically every race in some form or another. But the big question is Seattle is unaffordable and it's very hard to live here right now. And we need to do something about it. And one lane of Seattle politics wants to do nothing and then just arrest people who can't afford a house. And the other lane wants to do something, which is taxation, and then build houses, right? Like our homeless population are people without homes. I'm always shocked that the problem is in the name and yet we still wonder what's causing it. So if we can finally tap into this amazing wealth we have in the city to build housing for those of us who need it, we can actually solve the problem of people being without homes. And that's not a problem you can solve with either pledges or voluntary donations or police.
Debbie, did you want to get that one?
Yeah, I also feel like that what's happening right now in the races in city council as well as the mayoral race, it is a backlash, I believe, on work that has been advocated by activists, by Black Lives Matter activists, by police accountability activists and community members, by activists that have been and advocates that have been impacted the most by COVID and who are advocating for solutions like, renters' rights has been mentioned, the extension of the moratorium, certain rent control continues to come around, even though the city council has just passed, that you have to, that landlords need to give a 6-month leeway to renters, which is a great path to rent control, which is obviously the point of that. But there's a backlash, and I think that it's pretty apparent even in the Teresa Mosquito race. I thought that she, I feel confident, but I'm still kind of surprised that this kind of unknown person, Kevin, is like coming out of the blue and people are now interested in him.
I think his name is Kenneth, but also I'm not sure.
Well, that's how much I know. Okay.
Yeah.
I just started seeing some of his signs in my neighborhood. I live up in North Seattle, and I'm like,
yeah.
What? And so, I mean, I think it's a reaction. And I think that what I also think is interesting is that many of the candidates that are moving forward with with our website's very old. I wouldn't use it, but many of the candidates who are on the more progressive end. I see them really listening to community-led solutions and trying to move forward in new ways that aren't status quo. And especially I think homelessness is a great example of this. Like, we advocates have been advocating for years on the need for wraparound services that are funded to really lift people in places and for people to be able to dream and go in places that they want to go out of homelessness. But we need to truly support people in order to do that. We know what's needed, and it's funding that has been the biggest obstacle. And so what I'm seeing progressive candidates talking about is really digging in and solving these issues from a comprehensive, long-term upstream approach versus more of a Band-Aid approach. And I think that there's backlash around that because it's a scary investment, I think, for some folks. And it's hard to sell to people kind of this upstream approach that does seem like you're spending more money up front, but in fact, you'll be spending less money if you just see it as a money issue rather than, let's help our neighbors, accomplish their, dream and feel whole. So it just kind of, it depends your approach.
I think it's only fair that I bring up Devin's website. Let's compare. Oh, that's actually very sleek. Very nice.
I built it myself. I do everything.
Wow, well, good job.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing the media really likes to vilify the homeless and the houseless. And so we probably all at least heard of, if not watched, the Seattle's Dying, mockumentary or propaganda. But Seattle's not dying, Seattle's dividing, right? So I grew up here, used to write for the Seattle Gay News almost 20 years ago now, which is shocking to realize. But I was broke for so many years of my life, and it was fine because Seattle was a small, affordable place. And Seattle is not affordable anymore, right? We've had so much wealth move here, both in new people and in new companies and in new innovations. And that is generally a thing to be happy about. But with that wealth, we need, more transit, more housing, more investment. And we've not done that. And so what's happening is that the people who've not been, lifted up by that incoming wealth and private sector, income, they're being priced out of houses. They're being pushed out of jobs. They're unable to kind of keep up. If you're, a barista or a bartender now, it is really hard to make do in Seattle. My first house I rented a room was $300 a month. Good luck finding that now. If that was my current income, my income was $315 a month, right? I really floated. I would be on the street, and that's really tragic. And so it's not that, there's this push from the leftist candidates that want to punish business. It's recognizing that with that rising income levels, we also need to accommodate people who can't keep up, but who are also, living here, or, I think 3/4 of our homeless population is already from King County. So it's not like people are moving here. It's people who just, used to make money juggling and now they can't make it anymore.
I wanted to ask both you and Devin, what are the issues that really separate these two candidates?
So this is still the mayor's race?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest one really is, are you going to ask rich people for their participation, or are you going to tax them? Bruce is really running on a "don't worry, bro, I'm not going to tax you" campaign. And that's embarrassing, right? You don't run for mayor to run a nonprofit. He could collect philanthropic donations right now as a private citizen. And so, as we'll see in basically every right lane election cycle, because they're all kind of being funded by the same donors, he's saying, don't worry, I'll do nothing. There is no status quo in Seattle. If we do nothing for 4 years, that would be more expensive housing, more people on the streets, more homelessness, right? The private sector will keep on innovating over the next 4 years. We saw that during the pandemic. The rich keep on being creative. Amazon will be fine. But he's running on a "don't worry, I won't touch you" campaign. And his donors know it. That's why they're giving him hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the REIN is trying to say, no, we need to take care of the residents of Seattle, not the corporations of Seattle. And so most of that will be taxation. But that will also be things trying to fight back against our very right-wing and very aggressive police force, trying to encourage them to do things like not violate our civil rights, not beat the Mexican piss out of us, as they are prone to do. She's, as a leftist campaigner, she's really trying to run on the, it's not okay, right? We can solve these problems, but it requires affirmative government action, not a hands-off approach.
Now, Fernando, who is financing these two candidates?
Well, the main data that I looked at was PDC data, which is Public Disclosure Commission data that is at the state level. There's also municipal data you can look at that'll have some overlap there. And when I looked at the mayoral race just from individual contributions, this doesn't account for PAC spending. So there's been PAC spending in the race for sure, lots of that. But I like to look at individuals just to kind of know who characterizes the kind of funding and backing a little bit. And when you look back over that history, some of the individuals I saw donating to Lorena, the first individual contribution in there was something like $550 from UFCW 21, which is essentially a group of grocery workers, a union for grocery workers who, pool their money together. And if they make political contributions through UFCW 21 like that, it's really coming from all those people who've been providing us food during the pandemic and going through that. There is some more detail there on Twitter that goes into a lot of the individual contributions that I noticed in that race. But a few particular highlights, I think that's for the position 9 race. There's also a mayoral and a city attorney one. But for this race, after I looked through just kind of, to be honest, a list of non-notables for Lorena's donations. And what I mean by that is they're all, under, or for the most part, under $550, which was the one of those kind of common benchmarks there. When I look at Bruce's donations, it turned into kind of a who's who of Seattle real estate and the kind of like top level barons of the real estate industry in Seattle. You'd see people like John Goodman, who's a mega landlord who owns 40,000 units of housing, or a part of one of the organizations that he works with owns 40,000 units of housing, who's given about $90,000 in the race. There's George Petrie, who's a CEO of Goodman Real Estate, that gave somewhere around $62,000. And then I believe his spouse, Alyssa Petrie, donated about $39,000. So combined, you see these not just $10,000 contributions, even you start to see orders of magnitude up at the very top. And then as you go down the list, you'll see, $1,000 contributions, multi-$1,000 contributions. And some of this for different races was from candidates who have a longer electoral history. So it's not just in one particular race. But I think when you look at the electoral history and you see somebody over the course of their political career getting $100,000 from a mega CEO in real estate, you, if you're a renter, you look at that and you say, I wonder which candidate is going to support my interests. And to me, that always makes me a little hesitant or skeptical. If you have like any follow-up questions on those particular points, happy to dive into them a little bit more.
Not particularly. I know that people can ask questions in the comments if they have them any, and we'll have time at the end, hopefully, for people to ask a few questions. Now, we kind of talked a little bit about what separates these two candidates. Now, there was a controversy recently, obviously, about an ad that Lorena Gonzalez ran against Bruce Harrell. It talked about, his defense of Ed Murray, who was accused of, sexual abuse against minors. Let me bring in Debbie here. And I'll bring back Devin. So my question is that a fair criticism of him to talk about his defense of Ed Murray? And is it racist? Is this ad racist? Because obviously he's a Black and Asian American.
I mean, personally, I think that the ad, the most important thing is that it had an impact. It had an impact on African-American folks, and it had an impact on Bruce himself. And I think that that's what's most important. And the optics were that it was, I mean, let's be really clear. For any survivor to come out the way that this survivor did is a big deal, and it's difficult. And it's even more difficult and much more of a risk for a survivor of color to do so. Mm-hmm. But the optics are that it was a white cis woman who was brave enough to talk about her experience, and then juxtaposed with a Black man. And just the optics alone, it had an impact. And that impact for many people in the African-American community, it was racist. One of the things that I appreciated about Lorena is that she listened to community, and she honored the survivor that did share her story, and she said she acknowledged that it had an impact, and that she herself, especially as a woman of color herself, she knows that there's a higher bar around optics and around what ads look like and so forth. And she made a decision to take or to not continue the ad, but didn't back down on her conviction, and really speaking out for survivors and being an ally herself, that how Bruce handled the situation with Ed Murray impacted survivors greatly. And I mean, I've been talking to survivors all week, and how it's had an impact that's been horrifying and continues to be horrifying. And that it doesn't matter if someone was a convicted child molester 30 years ago. Human beings, adults are still impacted by what happened to them 30 years ago. So that in fact, someone who has committed that type of a crime does get to be judged by it. And Bruce fumbled on it, and he was an apologist around what was really going on. And I think another contrast that I've been seeing and witnessing is I haven't seen Bruce actually address.
Thank you.
He hasn't actually addressed his stance on that he made a mistake, that that wasn't his most shining moment, and he hasn't acknowledged that. He hasn't acknowledged the impact that he's had on survivors. He hasn't acknowledged the impact he's had on survivors of color within his own communities, Asian American and Black community, both men and women, and LGBTQ, non-binary and trans people. And that's a huge difference. Lorena has, and he hasn't. And that is a character witness around leadership and who you are and how you're going to show up. Because we all know, elected officials make mistakes. We're witnessing the two different, very different leadership styles. When you make a mistake, what's going to happen? Are you going to acknowledge it, learn, and move forward, or you're not? We're witnessing it right now.
And if I can jump in, just like to bring us back to that period 4 years ago, so Ed Murray was a huge staple of the gay community. He kind of helped bring us gay marriage in many regards. It was shocking when the news came. And so when the first allegation came forward, I think I, like many people, were like, this feels a lot like what, a person who was trying to attack a gay man would say. But then a second allegation came, and a third, and no one was calling for the mayor to get out of the way when all of his former, these young Black teens that he'd been raping as kids came forward and said, I want accountability. And so Bruce Harrell defended him. Lorena actually pushed for him to resign. But the people who actually at the time were saying that Ed Murray needs to resign was Danny Askini from Gender Justice League, Michael Maddox, who was a gay man running for council, I believe, at the time, or if not, a gay politically active man. It was Bruce Harrell did none of the work. He sat by the powerful and defended them, thinking that he could just write it out. And people who are actually hurting by that, just horrific moment in time. It was so traumatic to have this very high profile gay man actually be a child rapist, because that's basically what everyone uses to make fun of every gay person. And Bruce defended him. He tried to kill time. He tried to wait out the term. And that is so much worse than the optics of an ad, because the intention behind the ad was clearly not to be racist. The intention was to go back to what was done 4 years ago. And what's frustrating is Bruce said this on the city council dais, right? It's on this, Seattle channel somewhere. I couldn't find it myself, but I wish they'd just run his tape, because there's nothing racist about Bruce's own words. Those are Bruce's actions, and he failed. And I wish he hadn't run a second time, because I think this is something that I'd rather not have to live through again, because it was a really dramatic period for a lot of people. And there would have been another candidate who didn't have this baggage, and Bruce decided to run anyway.
Absolutely. Pulling up a story about it. So I want to move on to the city attorney's race, because obviously people have been following that very closely. So basically, as you know, Pete Holmes is a 3-term, Seattle City Seattle City Attorney, excuse me. And obviously he got voted out basically in the primary election. And now we have Nicole Thomas Kennedy and Ann Davison. Now there's obviously very distinct differences between these two candidates. One is a registered Republican. She, ran as a Republican candidate for lieutenant governor. Let's see. While Nicole Thomas Kennedy was a public defender for many years, about 4 years, she went on to start her own law firm. She did eviction defense and pro bono work. And obviously, as far as who's supporting who, the Democratic district organizations are all supporting Nicole Thomas Kennedy, as is Mayor Mike McGinn and a couple of city council members. And then Ann Davidson, of course, has like all living governors and 2 Supreme Court justices. Now, I wanted to ask you guys, like, what should people be thinking about in that race?
I think we should be thinking about what it would mean to have somebody who didn't share the values of Seattle as Seattle's attorney. The city attorney basically plays the role of the attorney for all of city government, including the residents of Seattle. So I think that the Republican Ann Davison is really trying to push this as like, I'm going to arrest the homeless, blah, 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 and put them in a Sam's Club up north. Like, that's one of her weird made up policies. But like, the role of the city attorney is to defend the city. One of the reasons that Pete Holmes may have lost the primary was because he defended Jenny Durkin when she erased her text messages. That's a decision he could have made. He could have said, actually, you know what? I'm not going to do this because even though I'm your attorney, I don't agree with this. And so we need someone in that role who will know when to fight, because attorneys can really fight, and then when to say, you know what, I don't support this. I'm not going to stand for it. And so I got 15 mailers today saying, look on Twitter. But like, the job is not on Twitter. The job is in a courtroom. Only one candidate is actually really a practicing attorney who goes to court. But more importantly, we just need to think, what would happen to Seattle if we had a different city attorney? Pre-Pete Holmes, the city attorney before him was another like tough on crime, Tom Carr, city attorney. He made it really hard to open up like a patio, right? Like, he had a very strong anti-alcohol bias based on some alcoholism in some family. And so if you wanted to have like a small cafe that had a wine option, he would go out of his way to get in the way. I had friends that were baristas and, or not baristas, bartenders and bouncers. And he would run stings where he'd send like a 19-year-old with a fake ID and then arrest them if they didn't catch it. And like, you're not a document forger, right? You're a bouncer. So like, there's a lot of power in what this role does. And we really need to focus on who's going to be the city's attorney and not who, said what on Twitter, because that's not what the race is about.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. So basically, the city attorney sort of prosecutes low-level crimes and also like protects the city as far as defending the city and representing city employees who are being sued in civil court cases. Good point, Devin.
And if I can I'm the annoying lawyer in this race, but the like 2 really big cases that stand out to me is, one, all those wealthy people we're talking about in the last race are suing the city because they don't want to pay the taxes we just passed, right? So Teresa Mosqueda, Lorena, they passed a tax on big businesses to fund housing. Big businesses then sued and said, how dare you? I have a right to my money. Leave me alone. And the city attorney has generally won these lawsuits because the wealthy have bad lawyers and their arguments are bad. But like, this is important, right? And then separately on the police discipline issue, Pete Holmes defended the firing of, he was Officer Adley Shepard. I'm pulling up my notes here, but this was his police officer who punched a handcuffed victim, like, a handcuffed person he'd arrested, who was in the back of his car, and he punched them in the face because he was mad at them. And so the city attorney, being in the role as the city's attorney, had to defend the city when they fired this cop, and the cop was like, how dare you? I deserve the right to punch people who are handcuffed in the car. And so having somebody, again, who knows how to fight and then will fight for the right issues is really important, because like, that's the job of the attorney. And now I'll shut up.
I think one other thing that I think you touched on there was some of those the tweets, right? And I think it's important to contextualize what was going on during that. From my understanding, Nicole Thomas Kennedy and her daughter at the time were probably being tear gassed in the context of what's going on there. And I think I'd have some choice words for the people tear gassing anyone I cared about. That might have been at least as volatile, kind of to take out of context and look back on if that was happening to me or my family. So,
Yeah, when it comes down to it, hopefully we're getting beyond to a place of we're just judging people on tweets, but we're actually hopefully judging people on their record and how they show up and what they plan to bring into the office. And my hope is that I like how you put it, Devin, is that we have a candidate that's going to continue the values of Seattle and really come at this from what I really like about her is that she's really thinking about rethinking what crimes to actually pursue and like misdemeanors, like rethinking things so that we're not jailing youth at an absurd rate, that we're not jailing homeless people, that we're actually we're actually using those resources smartly, and that we're trying to help folks get them into the places so that people can dream and have successful lives rather than having a criminal record because they slept on the street or something. Like, I like how she's moving things forward. I do think that those are Seattle values. I really appreciate how you frame that. And we want to uphold that. And again, that's why I it just comes back, like, this feels like a backlash. Here we have this very conservative Republican. How does she represent Seattle, and how hard we've fought to really move forward and deal with issues that are so dear to us, and certainly homelessness and housing, and really lifting each other up during a pandemic, are values that I think Seattleites have.
Well, and I think that we can talk again about why all of a sudden all this Republican money is coming into Seattle, but it's for the Republican. But also the abolitionist ideas, which is to decriminalize things that otherwise should be were criminalized. Pete Holmes already started doing that 12, 15 years ago. He ran on decriminalizing marijuana. That used to be illegal, and it used to be cops would mainly cite homeless people because they saw them because they didn't have a house to smoke pot in. And so, my white friends smoke pot and have been forever. And they would get their like green medical cards and be totally fine. But decriminalization was recognizing that even though people are making do if they already have, power, privilege, everything else, like, we need to make this is no longer a crime because it's being used to disproportionately punish those without. And so Pete started this. Like, he did a really great job for a while. And I think Nicole Thomas Kennedy is saying we can do more, right? Things that we, I think when you've been in office for a while, you can have a lot of good ideas, but you kind of feel like you're doing good. You have a good pace, and you have a challenge from, somebody who said, well, actually, I disagree because these things are still problematic. And there's actually a really powerful stranger story about just like a number of people who've been arrested and pushed through the penal system because they stole like a penny or because they ate a sandwich that was not theirs. But they ate the sandwich because they were dying of starvation, right? Like, this is not people stealing sandwiches and just to be rude. It's people who are really at the end of their luck. And just like, if you have nowhere to smoke pot besides the street because you're homeless, you shouldn't be punished. If you were about to die because you don't have food in your belly, we can think of another solution than putting you through the criminal justice system.
I actually had an interview with Nicole Thomas Kennedy, both for Malcontent News and the Seattle Gay News. The video of the interview for Malcontent News, the video, is on malcontentnews.com. And my interview for the Seattle Gay News, my favorite version, because I'm a print journalist, is available at sgn.org. So, but I wanted to show you what she said about why we should vote for her. Finally, I want to give you an opportunity to tell the voters why they should vote for you.
I think voters should vote for me because I have the experience needed in order to turn the ship around and right the ship at where we really should be going in terms of the criminal system. I have worked inside of it. I have seen what happens. As a public defender, I got to know my clients and their families and their living situations. And I saw the destruction that it wreaked on communities. So I think that's one of the best reasons to vote for me would be that experience that I have. I also think that what people really want in Seattle is a more equitable city. And when we have policies and processes and litigation that focus on helping the most vulnerable, that's how we're going to get ourselves out of the crisis that we're in. We're seeing a huge poverty crisis, crisis of people being unsheltered. And part of that is not focusing on the people who are most vulnerable. And so really turning to focus on what can we do for people to become self-reliant, to be able to support themselves, to be able to address their own problems and to get the help that they need to flourish in their lives. I think that's the thing that's going to really push us forward as a city and be the city that we really want. Because what I'm suggesting, I think sometimes is what people think is already happening, but it's not. Like I said, we can't prosecute our way out of poverty. We cannot jail our way into mental health, and we can't punish our way out of addiction. So we need to take some really common sense steps towards solving those problems. And that's what I'd like to do.
Thank you, Nicole Thomas. At Seattle. Let me bring back the panel really quick. So now I'd like to focus on the King County executive race. As you know, Dow Constantine, who is like a 3-term, county executive, is facing off against Joe Nguyen, a senator from West Seattle. Obviously, that's a powerful job. The King County executive oversees the bus and transit system. They, oversee the jail system. They oversee the sheriff's office. They're responding to homelessness. So basically, who has the competence here to get the job done?
I think that Dow Constantine has a lot of experience. And I mean, I was just reading an article where Joe was talking about, changing the tax structure of an income tax. And the truth of the matter is that that's not really within the jurisdiction of, at King County level. That is really a statewide issue. And so I appreciate the gesture. There's a lot of advocates that are trying to do that, and I think we should. But it just kind of, it struck me that that it wasn't on the mark as far as what can truly be done at the executive level, and I think that really demonstrates kind of a lack of understanding of what you're able to do in this position. And I think that Dow, there's certainly things to criticize about Dow Constantine. I do think that, I'm certainly for new leadership, but not just for the sake of new leadership.
I do think it's funny to bring up the income tax thing, because as a state senator, that would be what a senator would do.
Exactly.
I mean, there's an argument to be made that a smaller municipality or county could try to do things differently to bring litigation, but that's also a better city issue. I will say that I like Joe Nguyen's push for free transit. It's one of those things that I've been, advocating for years. And so it's exciting to see someone pick that up. But actually, so as the executive director of Upgrade Seattle, I've been doing a lot of work around the idea of having a public internet utility. Joe Nguyen actually sponsored a bill earlier this year that would limit counties' abilities to provide public internet. So there's kind of a weird role to be playing where he's trying to both run for office as the head of King County and had written a bill previously that would have denied the county the ability to actually provide internet as a public utility. The House actually fixed the bill, so it's fine. The county can do this now. And if Joe wants to do it now as executive, good on him. But I think that I've seen him have a lot of really good ideas, and I've not seen them necessarily enacted yet. And there are plenty of things that can get in the way of progress in Washington State and Seattle and King County. But yeah, his record's kind of interesting in that, because sometimes he does one thing and says the other, and that's frustrating.
Let's see. Oh yeah. So obviously there was a press conference today. Dow Constantine was out there in front of the cameras in the lobby of the old Holiday Inn here in North Seattle, talking about his plan for homelessness, what he called a blueprint, for the region. And he was talking about health through housing, which is like 8 properties that King County is bringing online. They're in different levels of development. The Holiday Inn is now going to take guests this week. So has Constantine done a good enough job in addressing homelessness, or is it too little too late?
I mean, the 4,000 people sleeping outside in the rain would say too little too late. But I mean, I think the problem there is that Joe has to prove that he's going to do a different job. I do think it's been too little too late. I think during the pandemic, we saw some frustrating back and forth where the county would finally realize that maybe people needed their own rooms, because that's a pretty basic thing that, like, I, as a house person, have my own bedroom. And like, because they're going to push people in, Joe's backyard, there's some pushback that, like, this is inappropriate. I don't want homeless people here. And that's generally the frustration whenever you try to provide services for homeless people, the neighbors around say, I don't want them here. And that's frustrating. And so I'm glad to see that we're finally trying to do more. But I would generally say the county has failed at this too. I don't think that anyone looks good right now. Like, people are outside right now.
I know that just from experience in working within LGBTQ communities, particularly in South King County, there's so much frustration. There's just so many LGBTQ folks that are at risk of losing their homes within the pandemic, without the moratorium, and they don't know how to get services in South King County. There's lots of different reasons for that, but that just represents that there's not enough being done, certainly in South King County, around addressing homelessness. And there's been continual pushback on different facilities that have been, like, popping up in Kent and so forth. And just, there seems to be kind of different controversies coming up, when the real need is that there needs to be access to shelters or transitional housing, particularly in South King County. Because not only are LGBTQ folks moving to South King County, but so are folks of color, and have been for a while, because they're being priced out of Seattle. And that's really where King County can have an impact and need to be leading around addressing homelessness from a regional perspective.
Great. So basically, I want to move on to the position 9 race for city council. This is a citywide position. It's been vacated by Lorena Gonzalez, who obviously is running for mayor. We have Sarah Nelson, who owns Fremont Brewing, up against Nikita Oliver, who is an executive director of a nonprofit, also a lawyer and an activist for racial justice. What should voters be considering in this race?
I mean, I'm both very excited about Nikita's candidacy and so bored of Sarah's. She ran 4 years ago, and kind of just lost the primary. But like, if not Sarah, we've had candidates kind of like this in every cycle, where they run on, hold on, you're moving too fast. I hate all these new regulations on business. You're really making business the bad guy. Come on, I'm just a small business owner of a business that makes over $1 million a year, by the way. And so, don't tax me. Don't require I provide my employees sick leave. Don't require I provide my employees a steady schedule. It's so cookie cutter, leave businesses alone, that I get really tired of hearing it, because I've just heard it over and over again. And I think that we live in a country, a state, and a city where there's so few protections for workers that, I've had friends who've given birth and gone to work the next day. That's embarrassing. And so to hear people, say, gosh, it's just really hard that my $1 million a year business is going to have to take care of people when they, go into labor, or after they've worked for me their entire lives. It's not worth even giving credence to, because it's just reactionary conservatism, and it's depressing. But I'll let somebody else go.
I mean, that's also the impression that I got from looking at the donor data when you're just trying to figure out who is funding these campaigns. You look at the difference between the two campaigns, and I have to do a disclaimer here. I've donated and volunteered in this race for Nikita, but if you look at the donor data, it's pretty clear. It's Nikita's getting all individual contributions from workers across the spectrum at lower level, like job titles, from what it looks like in the data. If you have, of course, one of the most common jobs in the city is software engineer, so you're going to see that on both sides. But you'll see like software engineer, teacher, physician, something else on Nikita's side, all below usually a lot of the top thresholds of like 550. And then you start looking at some of the other you can show my threads too. Thank you for finding that site. This is the eternal problem I have when doing both politics and technology is the people who care about my politics have no concerns about my technology and vice versa. But when you look at the funding here for the race, it's there are more CEOs giving to Sarah Nelson's campaign than there are teachers. And like you look at the Nikita campaign, it's quite literally the opposite. And the CEO donors to Nikita are usually the CEOs of a nonprofit foundation or a one-person company. So I look at those and get just initial guttural reactions for myself about, okay, well, I know what's happening here. And then you dig further into the data and look at some of just the top level donors. You'll see $1,000 contributions from somebody whose colloquial title is the Baroness of Fremont, right? Because they own so much property in the Fremont area. I believe this was in a separate campaign, but also giving to both Nikita and to the NTK race. And it's kind of just down the board, some more business owners who also have some vested interest in delaying their workers' ability to get guaranteed sick leave and get pay when they have a child that they're taking care of. It's those sorts of things. I mean, I kind of go further than you from what it sounds like, Devin. I have no pity for those business owners. Like, I've run a business before. I work for myself right now because the prospect of hiring employees and having their livelihoods in my hand and having to make sure that they have those things guaranteed for them is terrifying. And if these people running these $1 million businesses don't feel that way, I have zero pity for them when they are making that much money and aren't willing to make sure their employees have a good life. It also falls back on us because those are sometimes the sorts of companies where those people have to get public assistance, and I'm all for all those public assistance programs, but that means that they're making us pay for them instead of doing it themselves when we should be taxing them to fund it.
One is a fun through line. So Sarah also likes to talk about her time working as for city council member Richard Conlon. Richard Conlon was the guy who lost his seat because he opposed paid sick leave. So he was the council member that Shama beat in her first race. And the biggest push was this guy voted. He's the only solo vote fighting for worker sick leave, and she beat him. And so like this kind of reactionary business, how dare I have to take care of my workers thing, is a through line through many races. But also Sarah's been around the block a few times.
Well, and I also think that there's a big component of race in this as well. Nikita is well known for, she's an abolitionist. They are an abolitionist, and they are working towards and really honor community-led solutions around safety, and therefore the business perspective is like, we need police to protect our property and our businesses, and not really looking at a long-term solution and impact that around safety and that safety shouldn't just include property and businesses. And that again is Nikita has been very involved as a leader within the Black Lives Matter movement. And again, I feel very much that this is a backlash that's happening nationally, but it's even happening here in Seattle. They are also part of the LGBT community. They are outspoken about centering Black trans women within homeless issues, within worker rights issues, around renters' rights and housing, and are comfortable doing so, comfortable centering marginalized people that often probably a lot of Seattleites don't know a lot about, or certainly aren't familiar as much with some of the impacts and challenges that, I mean, that not a lot of people maybe know about the impacts and challenges of Black trans women. And Nikita centering that and talking about solutions. And I think that that's exciting. It's refreshing. It's definitely, I hope we all benefit from it. Like when you center the most impact, we all benefit. We just don't all know that. And so it's an exciting movement and moving forward. But again, I think that a big difference is just perspective and who Nikita is and who they represent.
I want to thank everyone participating in the program. I want to finally thank Devin Glazer, Executive Director of Upgrade Seattle. We have Debbie Carlson, former Executive Director of LGBTQ Allyship, and Fernando Medina Corey. Again, thank you all for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
And I just want to
Thank you
make
for having me.
one little final pitch. So I'll let you all go. And that is, I want to remind everyone that, the election is underway, that ballots must be postmarked by Tuesday, November 2nd, or deposited into a ballot drop box by 8 p.m. on November 2nd. And then, of course, ballots can be returned by mail, a ballot drop box, or at an accessible voting site if you require assistance. Postage is not required. And again, if you haven't gotten your ballot by now, I would definitely call King County Elections and find out where your ballot is. And if your ballot is lost, you can go to King County and vote there at their office in Renton. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time on Renee Reports.